One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Counting down to 50 years since man first walked on the moon, and today we will look ahead to see where in space man might walk 50 years from now. Welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, and July 20th marked the 49th anniversary of American astronaut Neil Armstrong's historic first step onto the moon's surface. This first step marked the breathtaking achievement of the goal set 8 years earlier by then U.S. President John F. Kennedy.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Current U.S. President Donald Trump marked this historic occasion with a statement calling for the United States to return to the moon and do more to grow space commerce, leading the way for a human mission to Mars. President Trump also said the exploration and development of space represents the best of American values. In a few minutes, we're going to talk about America's space future with the man responsible for the business of space for Boeing. And we will also speak to an activist for space settlements. But first, before we can look ahead, we should understand where we've come from. And to help do that, I went to the Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia. It's part of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, and it is where the big stuff is on display. Airplanes, rockets, and even the magnificent Enterprise space shuttle. I went into the museum before the doors even opened to the public and talked to Valerie Neal, the chair of the Smithsonian Space History Department. And we talked about future challenges and their dependence on the success of the past.
Well, it's great to have you here, Greta, at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum today.
This is absolutely spectacular. And just for starters, over your right shoulder, what is that?
Well, that is one of our crown jewels. That is the Space Shuttle Discovery, which was one of 5 orbiters that flew from the 1980s until 2011. This was the mainstay of our transportation to space for 30 years, and we're very pleased to have Discovery. It flew more missions and for a longer period of time than any of the others.
We started with, I think, 5, tragically lost 2, the Challenger and the Columbia. But this one has done, almost 40 missions?
Yes, 39 missions, and it's flown every type of mission that the space shuttle was designed to fly. So it's an excellent representative of U.S. space flight over that 30-year period.
Well, it's absolutely spectacular when you actually get up close and look at it. I mean, as exciting as it is for an American to have the space program and to see this, actually when you get up it's even more exciting.
Well, it is, and it's because it was a reusable spacecraft, and people often ask, are we going to clean it up, repaint it to make it look sparkly white and crisp black again? Of course we say no. It flew 39 times, it should look like that. But I think it wows people because it's so much larger than the capsules were in the 1960s. And when people saw shuttle launches on television, it was minimized in size. So when you encountered the real thing here and see its size, you really appreciate what we were doing in space during that period of time.
Well, I don't want to date myself, but you also have something that looks like the Jetsons, an astronaut in a vest that went outside the space capsule and could fly.
Right. The idea of jetting around in space goes all the way back to science fiction. In the 1940s and 50s, and the United States did develop a jet backpack for astronauts, and they used it on 3 different missions in 1984, and we have the one that was first flown. It's called the Manned Maneuvering Unit. It could have been called the Astronaut Maneuvering Unit.
Or Woman Maneuvering.
Today it would have to have a gender-neutral name.
All right, as exciting as this reusable spacecraft is and was, it's hard not to look back to the space race, the one that where JFK in 1961 said we were going to get to the moon by the end of the decade, which, quite frankly, we'd never been to the moon or in space, so it seemed almost ridiculous.
That's correct. We had 15 minutes total experience in space when President Kennedy made that challenge, and so it was almost beyond imagining that it could be achieved. But it was in fact achieved, and we're coming up on the 50th anniversary next year of the first landing on the moon. So for those of us who've been around here long enough, we can remember that. The excitement, the awe, the disbelief that people were actually standing on and walking on the moon.
And we beat the Russians. I mean, it was a race with the Russians.
There was, and as the U.S. began to pull ahead of the Russians, of course they had the firsts in the early 1960s, but as we began to pull ahead, they denied that they were in a race to the moon. They were just going to space to do useful things in space, but we later learned after the Soviet Union collapsed that they were very much in the race to the bitter end.
All right, so after we went to the moon, the shuttle was our next step. And how long was the shuttle an operable program?
Well, it took about 10 years to develop the space shuttle throughout the 1970s. The first mission launched in 1981 and the last mission launched in 2011. So it was a 30-year program. Really inconceivable, the idea that you could keep flying these same vehicles again and again and do all kinds of practical work with them. And I think the shuttle represented a different idea of space that was more practical, perhaps easier to defend to the public than repeatedly returning to the moon. But after a while, the public became tired of having astronauts in Earth orbit. They lost interest in the shuttle program and wanted to see more exploration. And so exploration is where we're going in the future.
So it ended having gotten what out of it? I mean, besides the excitement, I'll take the excitement and the thrill of outer space, but what do you think that the space program is proudest about the shuttle program?
The space shuttle really democratized spaceflight because it only needed 2 pilots to operate it, but it had room for 5 other people. And those people could be scientists, engineers, physicians, even veterinarians. And so it opened up a much larger pool of candidates, and that included women, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, people who hadn't qualified when you had to be a test pilot to be an astronaut.
Well, that's how I think we lost the teacher from New Hampshire in the first tragedy with the shuttle, the Challenger, and then of course at Columbia there was an Israeli astronaut. I don't know if there were other nations involved in any of this, but
there were a number of guest astronauts aboard several of the shuttle missions, and they hadn't gone through the astronaut training like Krista McAuliffe had not. She had had a little bit of preparation, but they were not actually part of the astronaut corps. But it was thought at the time that the shuttle was safe enough that people who were not trained astronauts could fly on it, and that program to have guest astronauts eventually was going to include a journalist, and you might have been selected to fly on the space shuttle too. But after the Challenger loss in 1986, NASA suspended that program, and it was another 10 years or so before an educator flew, and she was actually inducted into the astronaut corps.
It's a rigorous training.
It is.
How long does it take to become an astronaut?
Well, it takes 1 year of basic training, you might say, which the astronauts say is like getting a graduate degree in astronautics. And then you go through about 2 years of more specialized training until you're selected for a crew. And then you go through another year of specific training for that mission. So it's usually about 4 years before your first flight.
President Trump has announced some sort of space force. The Air Force has always had jurisdiction over space, I think, in the Department of Defense.
That's
but
correct.
this may be a little different. How is this perceived?
Well, I think that people are giving it a lot of thought right now, and we'll see if it happens or not. But yes, we've essentially had a space force for 40 years, maybe longer than that, with the launching of satellites that do reconnaissance and communications for military purposes.
Well, space is always, it's a frontier, We have the space treaty, which a number of nations have signed. The United States has signed, of course, this treaty, which was a ban on nuclear weapons in outer space.
Right.
But naturally there's some concern whether some nations are going to put weapons up there or even try to disable communication systems. I mean, that's a danger.
That's a real danger, and we heard a talk at the museum just a couple of weeks ago from the director of United States Strategic Command, and that's very much on his mind and on the mind of the Strategic Command folks, is that space can be an arena for warfare. We don't want it to be an arena for warfare, but disabling communication satellites, disabling GPS would paralyze life here on Earth. We're also dependent on all that technology now. We have on display on the other side of the shuttle here a test unit that was tried out in the 1980s that's called a hit-to-kill vehicle. And the idea was that if the Soviet Union launched a nuclear-tipped warhead toward the United States, we would launch something that would go up and collide with it and disable it. Right now there is certainly at least a tacit agreement that nations won't do that to one another in space, but there's a lot of vigilance to make sure it doesn't happen, and the threat is always there.
And the space treaty is only specific to nuclear weapons, not to other weapons,
Right,
which is
to
why the tacit
conventions.
agreement, the nod and the wink and you won't do that, is hoped for.
Well, of course, lasers can be tremendously destructive, and so some of the tests that we have performed have been with laser operated devices that could disable another incoming weapon or another satellite as well.
Are we going to make it to Mars in our lifetime?
I certainly hope so.
What's the plan?
I'm a child of the 1960s, and I would like to see us get to Mars in my lifetime. I don't know that it's going to happen that soon. That's where NASA is allegedly heading now. Next is preparing for a human mission to Mars.
Americans are adventurous and strongly support pushing the boundaries of space. A new poll from the Pew Research Center shows 72%, that's nearly 3 out of 4 Americans, agree that it is essential for the U.S. to continue as a world leader in space exploration. And 80% say the International Space Station has been a good investment for the United States. And that should be good news for Peter McGrath, who is in charge of everything space for Boeing, which built the International Space Station. Nice to see you, sir.
Nice to see you, Greta.
Okay, so how exciting is it for Boeing to be part of the space program? I know we fly on your airplanes all the time, but what about the space program?
Yeah, Boeing really has been at the forefront of the space program since the beginning. If you look at Apollo, Gemini, and Mercury space station, the space shuttle, we've been part of all of those programs in partnership with NASA to bring human spaceflight, to the place where we are today.
All right,
so it's really been an exciting part for us.
So tell me, where are you taking us? What are you doing now?
So today we're working on a couple things. First off, I'll start with space station. We're actively working with NASA to keep space station going. There's a lot of capability left on that vehicle. All the analysis we've done says it can go to 2028 and beyond. So we're continuing to work on that. We're also working on building the next crew vehicle that's going to launch from U.S. soil, the CST-100 Starliner, which will start launching late this year with an uncrewed test flight and start taking crews to space station starting next year. So we're really excited about that.
When you look at what the space station has accomplished, and frankly, I'm one of those people, I don't care if we get a huge accomplishment. I just love the excitement that shows what we're capable of doing and who knows what's beyond. But what is sort of, when you sort of give the list of things that you think space station has done for us?
Well, there's a lot of things coming off station in terms of biological research that really have helped us not only prepare for future missions deeper in space, but also really benefited life here on Earth. One of the ones we talk about a lot is protein crystal growth that they do up on station. When you do looks on Earth, you get fractionated crystals. When you get up into space, you get pure crystals. And because of that, one of the research projects they did on Duchenne's muscular dystrophy actually showed a water molecule they couldn't see here on Earth, and that's allowing them to now develop blockers that can be used to fight Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So there's a lot of things. The other one we talk about quite often is osteoporosis. And there's several drugs that are being developed now by Amgen that they use the fact that when you go to space, you get accelerated bone loss effects. So it really gives you advanced or accelerated research. And that helped them lead to those drugs that now are on the market today, too.
How's it worked with Boeing? Does Boeing have contracts from the U.S. government? Because you're not totally privatized like some that we're seeing some of these people who are going off on their own and doing their own research into space. But you get contracts and partner with the government?
Well, on Space Station, we were originally contracted to design and build and assemble, work with NASA to assemble it in space. Today, we have the contract to sustain and operate it for them. So we do a lot of things around maintaining its operational capability. In terms of the CST-100 Starliner, we are a commercial partner with NASA in the sense that we're designing and building the capability that then we're going to sell to NASA as crewed services to Space Station.
I bet it seemed almost, when JFK said that we would go to the moon by the end of the decade, that frankly we'd never done it before, so that seemed pretty outlandish. But American ingenuity, and we got there. For Space Station, was it the same thing when it was proposed? That it just seemed like, how could we possibly do this?
It definitely was a challenge. We did have the opportunity to do Skylab, which was a great first step of looking at a temporary location for humans to operate in space. And there was some legacy with Mir on the Russian side. I'll say I started my career working on several elements that are flying today up on Space Station as an engineer. And it was challenging because you were definitely pushing the envelope, which is why it's a good, when you look at it from a perspective, it's good when the government leads when technology isn't that mature or the business environment isn't there to support a commercial venture. And that's kind of what Space Station originally was. And that's, as we look further into deep space, that's probably the same thing that I typically say governments lead and commercial tends to follow.
What's your wish list? What do you want to see us do?
I'd love to see us go back to the moon. We've been talking about that for a while. But whatever we do, I'd like to make sure that we make it more extensible than we did, I'd say, during the Apollo program. Something that allows us to take the capabilities we developed to get back to the moon and allow us to move on to Mars and maybe further in our solar system. Because it's really about learning, I would say, by exploring, we're learning not only technologies that help us here on Earth, but it also allows us to learn more looking at planets like Mars as to how we can better work with keeping Earth alive.
And tell me, would you like to go to the moon? Would you like to be up on the space station, or do you want to stay on the ground and watch this?
Yeah, I'm probably at my point in my career where I'm going to be watching more of it, but I'll tell you.
I know you probably watch it. I'll be watching too, but is it in your heart and your soul that you wish you could go?
Yeah, I'd say I'd really like to be able to stand there or float on the International Space Station, look back at Earth. I've heard that view is amazing. It really changes your perspective on Mother Earth.
It's absolutely fascinating, and Boeing's contribution has been extraordinary. Anyway, thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you very much.
Okay, it's one thing to explore space, and that is exciting, but it is another to create settlements and start truly living beyond Earth's atmosphere. Aaron Osterly calls himself a professional space activist. He's currently vice president for Polyspace, an independent space policy consultancy. Nice to see you.
Pleasure to meet you, Greta. Pleasure to be here.
Colonies?
Yes.
Where?
Everywhere. Everywhere we can send them. It's, our view is that space, the best way we get from space is making it useful for everybody. So it's not just, a government's going to the moon, or a government's going to Mars, or companies doing this little bit, but we need it to go for everybody. And so, building the marketplace that enables space settlement, building the technologies, the systems, how does Boeing not just create the next big rocket, but how do they create the 747 to go to Mars? Okay, you say you're an activist. What does that mean? So I'm involved in a number of different companies and organizations. Space Frontier Foundation is a big one. Alliance for Space Development is another one. And we focus on engaging in both growing the marketplace through active community building, and also engaging with policymakers and legislatures and suggesting ways to do things differently. For example, everybody, you say the word space settlement, colonization, everybody has that's cool, I want to hear more about
the Jetsons is what exactly. I think a lot of people think about, the Jetsons.
Except that's not actually part of NASA's charter. You would think that should be part of why we're doing this. Everybody talks about the big views of that, but that's not part of NASA's charter, and shouldn't it be? Another good example is if you're a lot of people are working on new systems, new transportation systems. Like you've got SpaceX with Elon Musk, you've got Blue Origin with or with Jeff Bezos, and they're all building their rockets that are making things very interesting. What if we can start launching on a day-to-day basis and go there all the time at much lower costs? How do we position that technology? Arguably exists now, or it could exist within 2 to 3 years.
Okay, so in the race for the moon, it was the United States versus the Soviet Union. The United States won, hands down. Who's in the race now to colonize, like put a colony on the moon or even beyond?
A lot of it comes from different companies. You have a number of large companies whose founders have vision built around using the resources of the solar system, using the
Are those business decisions, or are those sort of adventurous decisions?
Both. I mean, let's be honest. You can't. If there are asteroids up there that are worth billions, and if you could grab one and sell it, it'd be worth a lot of money.
To do what with?
What's the average price of things like titanium, of things like iron? If I could make it cheap enough, and I stipulate that's not a small problem, but if you can do that, you can do huge things with it. Another example is the zero gravity environment. That is, you had the gentleman from Peter McGrath from Boeing talk about the protein research world. There's a lot more interesting biological and tech development projects that require the zero gravity environment.
So in your lifetime, are you going to see a colony on Mars?
I hope so.
Hope so, or you really think so?
I'm betting on it. I think the world will change in the next 10 years when it comes to space in ways we don't understand. Because I think the costs will come down. I think the user base is going to grow greatly, and we're going to see major changes in how we do things.
I think it's very exciting, especially we're leading up to the 50th anniversary of the walk on the moon by a U.S. astronaut. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us.
Greta, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, who wouldn't want to go into space, right? Well, apparently 58% of Americans have no interest in going into space, according to a recent Pew Research Center poll. For a perspective of what it's like to go into space and live there, I turned to Terry Virts, an astronaut who piloted the Space Shuttle Endeavour in 2010 and commanded the International Space Station in 2015. Nice to see you, sir.
Good to be here, Greta.
Okay, if you could go back today or tonight, would you go?
To space?
Any place, yeah, space.
Yeah, sure.
Why?
Of course. It's cool. You get to float, and the view is pretty spectacular.
But what drew your attention? Why did you go into space?
When I was a kid, the first book I ever read was about Apollo, and something about that ability to go fly to the moon and fly rockets in space was just cool. And I grew up with pictures of airplanes and galaxies and everything like that on my room as a boy. I was just captured at a young age.
When I was a kid, just hearing the words coming, liftoff, I mean, it's like, I can't even imagine sitting there and being the one who's actually lifting off. What's it like?
Right now I'm a speaker in my new career, and I travel around the world, and every kid in every country, in China and Europe and South America, they're all fascinated by space. And the experience of lifting off is amazing. There's sound, there's vibration. There's acceleration. It feels like several of your best friends are laying on top of you because you're smashed in your seat so much. But that's just 8.5 minutes for what, for me, was eventually 7 months in space.
In 7 months, what happened to you physically?
That's a big question that NASA's been working on. And the space station has really done a great job of kind of solving that problem in some aspects. You're weightless, so your muscles and your bones are not exercised. And they would become weak, except for they've come up with an exercise protocol. 7 months in space, I lost 0% of my bone density, which is pretty amazing. A big exercise regimen every day, 2.5 hours. I came back to Earth pretty strong. I was able to do 20 pull-ups the week I got back. The one problem that we really haven't solved yet is radiation-induced cancer. And so you just get radiation in space that you don't get on Earth. It doesn't exist because we have an atmosphere. And that's something that, we need to be mindful of going forward.
Are you disappointed a little bit? At least, I was. I mean, when we landed on the moon, I think every American is old enough to remembers where he or she was watching it. But then once we sort of declared victory in that spectacular race against the Soviet Union, it seemed like things like, the attention a little drifted off of the American people. I mean, NASA was still very interested, but it seemed like we weren't getting as much attention on our space program. We weren't generating enough interest by the American people. Did you feel that way?
Apollo 13 is one of the best space movies of all time. And of course, Apollo 11 was the first moon landing. And 2 missions later during Apollo 13, there's a really good scene in the movie when the networks would not even carry imagery from the Apollo 13 live from space. So we lost our attention span within months. I mean, it only took from Apollo 11 to Apollo 13 for people to lose that. But there's still excitement, Greta. I tell you, honestly, I travel around the world. Every week I'm going somewhere. People love space and they're excited about it. It may not have taken up the network's time like, back in the 60s and 70s, but...
What do you make of the sort of private industry now getting involved in the space industry, not just partnering like Boeing with government, with contracts, but actually the wealthy people doing their own space exploration?
Right. Well, the 2 famous ones are, of course, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos with SpaceX and Blue Origin. I think, Greta, the first 50 years were about the government. Space is expensive, it's dangerous, it's hard. But I think the next 50 years, it's going to be different. Anytime the government gets involved, there's this bureaucracy, there's inertia, there's trying to keep this congressman happy or that congressman happy. When a private company is involved, they want to get stuff done now because it's costing them money, and they want that return on investment quicker. And there's a great thing to be said for that incentive. So I think the future in innovation is really going to be either in public-private partnerships or just in the private industry alone.
All right, so what's out there that we don't know? I mean, I hear about junk in outer space, but the garbage fields, and I hear about that. But what's out there that we really haven't talked about? What are you interested in?
When I was commander of the space station, I had to maneuver for some debris that was caused by a military satellite explosion about a decade ago. So yes, debris in space is a big problem. I think I've written some articles about this. I think the 21st century goal will be to go to Mars. Mars is a really interesting place. There is water there. You can see it with a telescope in your backyard and the polar ice. There's a really thin atmosphere. It's got a 24-and-a-half-hour day. So as far as potential for future human habitation, not just landing and coming home, but actually living there, it's probably the most promising place in the solar system.
Are we alone?
I have 2 thoughts on that. There are a lot of stars out there, and therefore a lot of planets. So you would think there's other alien life, but it's really far away, so it would be hard to ever find it. And life is so complicated. I mean, even a one-cell organism is infinitely more complicated than the complicated stuff that humans make. So I think unless somebody makes it, there's not going to be life. I think you need a creator. But you would think there would be because there's so many planets out there. So we'll see.
All right. Well, I'm insanely jealous of you. And who wouldn't want to go to space to have had your experience?
You can go soon, Greta.
I hope so. I'd love to. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Greta.
And that's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. And you can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And make sure you follow me on Twitter. It's @Greta on Twitter. Thanks for being plugged in.